Okay. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the Toby Center for Jewish Studies in welcoming cultural critic and journalist, staff writer for The New Yorker, Rachel Syme, to be in conversation with our year-long Shenson retrospective film series called Rewind. And this year we are focusing on Jewish women filmmakers, and we'll have plenty of time today to discuss what that even means. I want to just talk a little bit about our center. We are a center that promotes the academic study of Jewish history and culture and literature and languages across the disciplines at Stanford. We have graduate students, undergraduates, lots of interesting courses, and both in real life and in Zoom life, we have many programs, including creative ones like Rewind, and we're really excited about the energy that's been happening so far. If you want to follow what's going to be happening in the future with Rewind, please follow us on Twitter at Rewind Shenson, or follow me, Shayna Hammerman, and you'll see how to link to the Rewind. And one of the most exciting things is that one of the films we'll discuss today, which is Smithereens from 1982, directed by Susan Seidelman. We will have Susan Seidelman coming to talk to us about filmmaking and about one of her other very famous films, Desperately Seeking Susan, in January. So stay tuned so you can find out the details about that. So Rachel Syme, thank you so much for coming. Rachel is herself a Stanford graduate. And has written, in addition to her ongoing position at The New Yorker, has written for the New York Times, GQ, Elle, and famously the Stanford Alumni Magazine. We also welcome Eitan Kensky, the Reinhardt Family Curator of Judaica and Hebraica collections at Stanford Libraries. And this entire film series is really his brainchild, and so we really appreciate your creativity around this and your excitement around these films, which some of which I had never seen before, many of which. And then we also welcome Paloma Eisenberg, who is our undergraduate student director of the series. And Paloma is a junior at Stanford majoring in theater and performance studies. And she herself is a performer. And so I am going to turn off my screen and give the panelists the chance to have a conversation. And partway through, we will open it up so everyone can discuss. We are happy for you to raise your hand, and then you can show your face and be a part of the conversation. Or if you'd rather just type something into the Q&A or into the chat, that works too, and we will pass your question on. So thank you everyone for coming, and welcome.
Thank you, everyone. And really, thank you, Rachel, for agreeing to come and be here with us today to talk about these movies.
Sure.
I've loved your writing for years. And actually, one of the reasons that we thought it would be so much fun to talk about these movies with you today is that there's such a tangible love for New York, that shines through your writing and kind of all of the projects that you take on and all aspects of your work. So these are both movies about people kind of trying and maybe failing to find themselves as young people and creative people in downtown New York neighborhoods. So I don't want to ask something cliche like, what is it about New York City that makes it such a draw or magnet? But really, what is it about the city that makes it such a draw or magnet for young creative types who want to make something?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because New York is more or less an impossible place to live and has been for a long time. I mean, even, everyone always has these romantic visions of like early New York when, oh, you could be a bohemian here and pay $200 a month in rent and, live on just pizza and coffee and whatever other scraps you could find. And that did happen for some people. I mean, I know I was reading last year the book Ninth Street Women, which is a great biography of sort of a group of women artists in the 1950s, Helen Frankenthaler, Lee Krasner and the like, who were sort of like the female counterparts of sort of the Jackson Pollock abstract expressionists. And so much of their life in New York was so Spartan and so sort of makeshift, and none of them had any money. But New York has never been an easy place to live. I mean, and that's sort of a fallacy. It's like, even for F. Scott Fitzgerald, it was hard and it cost a lot of money, and he went broke in that famous essay, How to Live on Practically Nothing a Year. And then another essay he wrote as a follow-up, which is How to Live on $35,000 a year, which at the time was a ton of money, which he blew anyway, living in New York. So I think that the idea that New York is sort of an easy place is a myth, but people always come here thinking, I'm going to make it. I'm going to make it big. I mean, everything about New York is about scale, right? So it's like, if you want a big life, people think of the big city. I don't think it's necessarily the best place to come if you're an artist, who just wants to make art full time and that's your life. I mean, I think there are way better cities for that now. Even in the US, there's, well, in a non-pandemic time, there would be New Orleans, Detroit, Minneapolis, Portland, all these places that have really vibrant art scenes and can be a place where like a burgeoning artist might stand out and get a start, as opposed to New York, where you feel immediately swallowed up in its maw. That being said, there's nowhere else to come in the world if you want to do something giant, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess I also raised the question, like, biographically, like a lot of these, protagonists like chose to come to New York and not having grown up there and like make it a place, or like one of our protagonists.
Right. I was going to say the difference between the two movies is one's a kind of about an entrenched New York family and what it means to grow up in New York City. And the other one is about what it means to come from elsewhere. And I mean, I think, hang on, I'm going to get it up because I pulled it out the other day, which is my favorite E.B. White quote, which is that there are three New Yorks. There's the New York of the person who was born here, the New York of the commuter, and the New York of the person who was born somewhere else. And the idea of the New York that I think I identify most with is the New York of the people who are born elsewhere and felt the siren song to come here. I mean, you read it in sort of like Joan Didion's Goodbye to All That. She was from Sacramento and then felt this like drive to be in New York. Same thing with Nora Ephron. She was from LA and she felt this drive to be in New York. James Baldwin felt a drive to be in New York. I mean, I think there's a lot of, natives, and I think New York has a real native New Yorker culture that a lot of people forget too, because it's not just a city of transplants. People have been here for many generations. They're entrenched New Yorkers, but I do think that it is a city that sort of absorbs new people. I mean, people are always asking me, should I move to New York? Is it too late? And I said, it's never too late or too early to move to New York. And if you move away and you come back, it'll be like you never left. It just is, it's a sponge. It's a constant place of absorption. So I think that's one of the reasons people want to come is that they want to be a part of something. It's like they just want to enter a throng.
So if you have that three-part paradigm of like New York of the people who grew up here and New York of the people who imagine it from far away, New York is the city of commuters. Ren in Smithereens is from New Jersey. So
right.
Does she fall into the kind of, from far away, imagining the city, or is it just, or is it a commuter relationship? And does that even matter?
Well, I think that's an interesting thing about New York from people from the tri-state sort of region that aren't from the city. Like I remember I was watching an amazing, if anyone's interested in New York, really, what you should be watching is an 8-part PBS documentary Rick Burns made called New York, a documentary film. And there's a great section of that where Alfred Kaysen, the great former New Yorker writer, says that he grew up in Brooklyn and that the longest journey in the world was the journey over the Brooklyn Bridge from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And that was sort of like a glittering dream, so close and yet so far. And I feel like that is kind of the sentiment of a lot of people that are these commuters. I mean, you also have an example in like Don Draper, who has like a totally different life in Austining than he has in Manhattan. It's like these two worlds could be so close and yet so far apart. Like maybe New York has more in common with Los Angeles than it might with like a town in sort of suburban New Jersey in a strange way, even though they're geographically very close. I think Ren is an interesting case because it's like she sees New York as this like giant glittering dream. It's just right. It's like right there, but right. It means so much to cross, to get on the turnpike and come into town.
Or conversely, to leave, to like make that step to like re-engage with family.
Yeah. It's like coming and going. It's very significant for her, even though it's not that long of a distance.
Right. So before we get into the specifics of, either movie, I do want to talk about something that they share, which is, complicated, not always likable protagonists. And I think that kind of leads me to two questions. One, do you think this is something that we would notice or remark upon if these were male characters in movies directed by men? But also, is there something distinct and challenging about putting difficult women at the center of these films? Something, enervating.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously what you said, there's something of a double standard, and that I think sometimes, neurotic and obsessive, and in Ren's case, self-promotional artists and difficult people. I mean, they're both actually in Tiny Furniture too. She's a self-promoter. She has her gallery show, all that stuff. But I think, you know, in male characters, we may see that as kind of precocious, or, you know, they're just ambitious. And in women, it seems sometimes manic, or a little bit, for lack of a better way to say it, like nutty, or sort of craven or driven by some kind of, I don't know, selfish motive. But I honestly think that what's really radical and really brave about both of these movies, but particularly Smithereens, is like putting a really complicated and really like desirous woman at the center. I mean, Ren, just like, she's just like this ball of want. Like, she just wants so many things. I mean, the minute she gets to New York, she's like, why am I not famous? Like, why doesn't everyone know my name? Like, why am I not Warhol? You know, and there's this real like desire that she has to just have things. And I find that really great to see, especially in young women, because it's very rare that you get to just see a character that's sort of like an unabashed, like kind of like dervish of yearning. That's a woman that's really not apologetic about it at all.
So Paloma had a related question about Tiny Furniture that I want to let her jump in with.
Yeah, and this could be for Tiny Furniture and also for Smithereens. But I was going to ask, like, why do you think that we typically don't see characters like this on screen, like what you're talking about? And also, like, maybe getting more of, like, what exactly is this character, and why do we, you know, some people find that attractive and not? Is it just that she's, like, a real person? Like, both of these women, is it just, like, that they're real people?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's because there is a, you know, I don't think they fall into any particular trope. I think they're kind of neurotic and wandering and trying to figure out who they are. I mean, I think we have a long history of the kind of like Bildungsroman for men, like just wandering around and trying to figure out what do I think? What do I believe? Who are my people? We don't have as much of that for women. That's not like a marriage plot or some kind of a, you know, reintegration into a friend group or a family situation. We don't have a lot of stories about women out on their own. I mean, I often think that New York is one of the greatest places in the world to be by yourself and to be lonely, even though it is absolutely a place you can find community pretty easily. But I think, you know, I love to think about like Hopper paintings of women alone at counters and diners, and I think they feel so New York to me. And I think that it's just the woman loner is not a very common character or figure, or certainly not one that's aspirational. I mean, there's a reason that women by themselves are called spinsters and men are called, you know, eligible bachelors until they're 70. I mean, it's this incredible dichotomy. So that character is just not one that we're seeing a lot, which is why I think there's quite a bit of boldness in both of these films.
So Tiny Furniture is kind of like the extreme edge of an autobiographical film.
Yep.
Film a movie in your childhood home, cast your mother, cast your sister as your mother and your sister, put yourself out there in the center of it. And I'm wondering though, do you think that's also true for Smithereens? Do you think we should see Smithereens as kind of autobiographical fiction, or not really, that it is a kind of more universal story, albeit one that's very rarely told, or not as told as frequently?
Well, I don't think Susan would say that it was. I mean, Ren, I'm not sure is Susan Seidelman, but I think that obviously a lot of people pour their own experiences and their work into their movies. Though I think that there is always a sort of inclination to read women's projects as autobiographical and men's as somehow detached artistically from themselves, and that you're able to make, you know, a film without bringing yourself into it if you're male. I don't understand why that is the general going reading, but I think with women constantly people are saying like, well, how is this about themselves? Like, obviously Tiny Furniture is quite self-referential. I mean, that is Lena's house and her mother and Cyrus, who I think is non-binary. So, you know, and I think those are the people that surround her world. And I know Jemima Kirk is in it, and that was one of her real best friends growing up, who later appears in Girls. I mean, these are people that really populate her universe. And I think in lots of ways there's a scrappiness to that movie because she made it with what she could make it with. I mean, that's truly writing what you know. I mean, she was able to make that film on a shoestring because she had so much support, which I think some people get angry at her for and say, oh, she had artists' parents and therefore she had this easy entree into the film world. But I think in lots of ways, it was just she was starting with raw material that she was able to mine quite easily. And there's something about that feels very like scrappy to me, like just really like she just wanted to make a movie and so she did it. And I think, you know, Smithereens is much the same in that it's made for no money and you know, shot quickly and kind of on a kind of whirlwind schedule. But I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be read as autobiographical. That being said, I think it is capturing a very real world, which was this world of sort of young people in New York in the 80s who were quite like struggling artistically, financially, emotionally. And I think it reads as like very real, even though it might not necessarily be autobiographical, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the realness is very much tied into the look and the feel of the movie. You know, there's kind of an interesting inherent contradiction that Smithereens takes as part of its premise that the punk scene is moving to LA and it's over. It's not really there in New York anymore, but it's also, you know, makes everything that's happening in New York seem so cool and edgy and stylish and appealing. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the aesthetics of the film and how, you know, the clothes, the posters, the grime of the city. That
oh my gosh, I love the
the
aesthetics of Smithereens. I swear, I like want everything Ren wears. I feel like she has a real proto Lady Gaga look. Does that, especially in the like Who Is She posters that she puts around? I think there's a certain kind of like baby Gaga during her early sort of glam phase look that she has working. I like that she wears sneakers. I like that she wears sort of found vintage material. I mean, I think like no one can really like throw together a look like young punks in New York. I mean, it was all so catch as catch can. And I think the film has that all going throughout. I mean, the lighting in the film is just kind of dark and like sort of that pistachio green, and it feels kind of acidic and kind of like grimy, like you sort of feel dirty, like the way the screen looks. It kind of makes me think of, have you ever seen the Scorsese movie After Hours? It's like my favorite Scorsese. It has the same film quality, which is, I think of it as a very 80s New York film quality, which is like, I think it's like, how do I say this? It's like kind of all the streets are Batman. It's like steam's rising from them and it's a little gritty and it's a little, you know, like New York is Gotham type thing. But at the same time, there's all this sort of glittering stuff happening at the Peppermint Lounge and these punk clubs, and there's a lot of vibrancy. So you have sort of contrasts too. And I think New York probably felt like that. I think it probably felt kind of like dank and gross on the streets. And then you'd have these moments of like sweaty communion and lots of color and light and sound and, you know, people like Ren rushing around. And then it would be back to the grime. And I think that's kind of a palette I love. I think it's one of the things that really speaks to the film. I mean, I cover fashion for the New Yorker, so I'm constantly thinking about clothes, and the Smithereens is a movie I recommend to people when I'm like 80s fashion, you know, because people often think of 80s fashion as like neon, Lisa Frank, mall wear, you know, acid jeans kind of thing. And they watch Stranger Things and like think that's what it is. And I'm like, actually watch Smithereens because it looks like deeply lived in 80s fashion, which is a little different than the sort of parody of what it was.
Right. But then, you know, just to stay on clothes for a minute, you watch something like Smithereens and then you watch Desperately Seeking Susan, which is only a few years later, and you know the clothes and the style are so different. You know, we've kind of made the transition from like punk to new wave.
Exactly, and I mean, obviously Madonna, you know, in Desperately Seeking Susan, Madonna's look is like iconic and for the ages. And I think, and what I really like about, you know, Susan Seidelman is that she's clearly interested in style. Like I think that's really important. Like Ren is a different look. Ren is I would say just like kind of a street rat. Like she absolutely is picking things up off the floor and putting them on. Whereas, you know, Desperately Seeking Susan is a kind of film about very stylish New York girls. Right. It's a little bit different. But I like that she can span those, you know, two poles in a matter of years, and they both feel really authentic to the scenes that they're about.
Yeah, I mean, that's again one of the reasons why we wanted to talk to you about these movies, is because I think that the style of the movie is part of its story, it's part of its character, it's part of its argument. The clothes really are characters here. And, in Ren's case, they're kind of connected to one of the big, themes of the movie, which is like reinvention. That Ren is this character of, reinvention, and more specifically, maybe whether or not reinvention is actually possible. So, the flyer that she posts around town, reads like, "Who is this?" With a picture of her. She tries to, escape the suburbs. She tries to create this mystique of herself, but she's also trapped by, the values of everything that kind of came before. And more important, maybe more critically, this need to be validated by the men that she admires.
Well, sure, yeah, all the boys that she wants to impress.
Yeah. So, do you think that the movie holds that reinvention is possible, or what do you think it's trying to say there?
Well, I mean, it's a difficult thing, right? Because at the end, she's down and out and getting into a strange man's car and trying to figure out where she's going to go next. And it might not be somewhere where all that savory. I think you have a sense that she might have a really sad life. But you also have a sense that she might have an amazing life as well, a breakthrough. I mean, she wants it so badly still. She's not giving up. I mean, I think, a lot of New York, somebody once told me this when I was a young writer. They said half of being successful in New York is stick-to-itiveness. It's just sticking it out. Like, there's a lot of people that will just fall off and give up along the way. Not as a bad thing. They might decide, I want a big house in the suburbs, or they might decide, I want to move back where I came from and be closer to my family, or they might just decide this is just so not for me and I don't want to pay $3,000 a month to live in a roach-infected shoebox, infested, sorry. They might just give up. And if you really want it, you stick with it. If you're just like gum on the bottom of the city shoe, you probably surmount it at some point. And I think that's kind of how I feel about Ren. She's sticky. She's not going to give up. And that is about as much hope as that movie can impart, because it was a really hard time in New York. I mean, this is the Ford to New York drop dead era. This is the Bronx's burning era. This is the the streets were scary and the subway didn't work and the city had no money, and Robert Moses was trying to tear things down and bulldoze people's houses to highways. And I mean, it was not a good time in the city. And I think that a lot of people did get swallowed up by it. And you could see Ren as being a casualty of New York, but you could also see her as being a survivor.
Right. So I want to get back to that idea, but there's a question in the Q&A that I want to bring up now. And also, I'll say this to everyone. One of the things we're hoping is that there's a lot more back and forth this go around. Yeah. So please, if you have questions, type them or raise your hand. We can elevate you to panelists, and then you can appear on screen with all of us, whatever you'd like to do. So I'll read this question first. Do you think the vibrance of New York portrayed by these films will come back after the pandemic ends?
So I think there's different kinds of vibrance portrayed in either film. I think, listen, I'm no prognosticator of the future, and I'm not really an urbanist. So I think, it would be really interesting to put that to a city planner who might have an idea about what has happened historically after very difficult times. I do know that the Roaring 20s happened after the Spanish flu and the war, and New York was a quite vibrant time after crisis. And generally the city tends to bounce back from crisis. New York is a city of constant renewal and reinvention and building things on top of old things. And I think obviously New York isn't going away. I always think it's really funny when in sort of political debates, people trot out this New York is a ghost town, New York is a dead city. That's not what I'm experiencing living here. And it's certainly not what it's going to be like after. And if anything, I hope that it's closer to not necessarily the terrifying circumstances, but certainly the artistic spirit of Smithereens rather than Tiny Furniture, which I think, to its credit, was an artistic breakthrough in a time, but it was also made at sort of this kind of boom time in New York, the late 2000s, when things were pretty economically good here, and that's the time when all the corners were converting to Sweetgreens and Duane Reads, and a lot of the sort of life was being sucked out of streets of New York by corporate interest. And Smithereens is about, I think, a much more authentic and holistic city. And I would like to see that come back. And obviously, New York is going through a really hard time. I mean, I won't sugarcoat it. The businesses are closed. We are spiking again with COVID. I've been here the whole time. So I was here during the, Javits Center becoming a field hospital, USS Comfort pulling into the port, ambulances wailing through the nighttime. And it's been devastating to be here, but also bolstering my love for the city. And I think that there is going to be a vibrancy that's going to be quite extreme in my prediction when this is over. Like, I truly believe people will be partying for about 4 years straight in New York City. I think it's going to be a really exciting place to be. I think theater will come back. I think the opera will come back. I think ballet will come back. I think fashion shows will come back. I think all these things will come back. I think people are going to want to dress. I think like people are going to want to see and be seen. People are going to want to go to nightclubs. People are going to want to go to live music shows. I mean, I think this will be true of everywhere once COVID's over, knock wood that it is, that we get a vaccine and all this. I think that will be true of every street in town is going to be the hottest place to be, not your apartment. But I think New York particularly is going to have quite a resurgence. I hope, anyway.
So when you answered that question, you said something I found really compelling about tiny furniture, and something I wanted to ask you about. So you bring it up in this context of like a relative boom, late 2000s New York, a lot of redevelopment, a lot of gentrification of neighborhoods, a lot of hollowing out of neighborhoods, and having everything become a Dwayne Reed or Sweetgreens. But the other backdrop to that movie is the global financial crisis that was playing out,
Yep.
kind of everywhere else. So,
well, the global financial crisis also played out in New York. I mean,
exactly.
I tried to be a freelance. I tried to be a freelance writer for the first time. I started as an editor, and then I wanted to transition to writing, and I tried to do that for the first time in 2008, which was the worst year ever to try to be a freelance writer or anything that was precarious. And I remember it. I mean, and I have friends that moved to the city at that time and couldn't find jobs, and people who are kind of millennials have lived through this, period of, the financial crisis in New York was quite severe and quite real. And I mean, this is the place where it was all going down. I mean, Lehman Brothers closed, in the financial district, and a lot of Bear Stearns, a lot of other places were just like collapsing in New York City. So I think the financial crisis was felt very acutely here. And at the same time as certain kind of corporate things were booming, a lot of people were losing jobs, and a lot of people were sort of like, a lot of artists were not able to sort of sustain themselves, and a lot of people ended up leaving.
Yeah, but I do think that I agree with everything that you just said. And I think that's one of the interesting dynamics in that movie, is that Aura's story is a story of kind of moving back in with your parents.
Yes.
Or moving back in with your mother. And that's something that just happened to a lot of millennials in 2008, 2009, 2010, something it had to confront. And this is obviously a very different portrayal of that. But it was not a universal experience, but something that was very common at that moment, in time.
Yeah. And Lena's a little younger than me, but she's really, I think, in lots of ways, kind of like the voice of that particular experience, which was graduating from school in the middle of the crisis. Mm-hmm. And not even knowing how you make a first move, as opposed to you're 6 jobs in and then suddenly you're in a precarious position. I mean, these are people that are like, they've been told their whole life, you're special, you're going to be great, you're going to have all these opportunities, whatever you want to do. And then the minute that the world is all open to them, doors start closing. And I think, I think what's really interesting about that movie is it's like you said, it's a movie about moving back in with your parents. But what happens if your parents happen to be artists in New York City that live in an incredibly glamorous Tribeca apartment? Like, that's a different experience than having to like move into a basement in Nebraska or something. Like, it's not that one experience is better than the other, but it's just a totally different cultural experience. Like, I think in certain ways that movie is about what it feels like to be a burnout as a native New Yorker in a place where everybody is quite ambitious around you. And I think that's a dissonance that I think she explores quite well in that show. I mean, it's really interesting in that movie, that when she went on to make Girls, I mean, she had her character, Hannah, come from elsewhere.
Right.
She made it a point to have most of those characters not be native New Yorkers. She wanted them all to be like living the New York of the people who had the fantasy, as opposed to sort of her own experience, which was that of like sort of growing up here and having the ability to kind of just like loaf around in New York City. That's totally different vibe.
And while we're on just talking about tiny furniture, clothes also play a pretty important role in that movie. And I'm thinking about the Jemima Kirk character and how that's her form of expression and so forth.
Yeah. No, I mean, Jemima's a beautiful dresser and is throughout Girls and is in her own life as well. Every piece I've ever seen about her is just she's wearing something glamorous and a robe of silk satin. I mean, she has a bohemian way of dressing, and I think the character in Tiny Furniture does too. And there's a certain thing that's transmitting, which is privilege. You know, there's a lot of privilege in her character. Obviously, they're both privileged people, but I think there's also this idea of just sort of like true sort of bohemian gadabouting that Jemima's character is doing. And while she takes fashion seriously, she has trouble sort of seriously landing on anything that she wants to do. And I think there's that her clothes are sort of fabulous, and I love that apartment and sort of just the clothes strewn everywhere, and you know, you see just leopard print flung as kimbo, but there is something about it that feels like almost like negligent, like she doesn't even care about these clothes. There's a certain privilege inherent in that that's kind of I think the main character certainly resents.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting about that movie is the way in which there's kind of, they go back on independence, and that the arc of that movie is kind of becoming more and more dependent on your family as time goes by. That there's this plan to kind of live with a friend somewhere, you know, somewhere else, to have this apartment, to have this life together, and then it's just ignored. That the Aura character just ghosts her friend until her friend shows up at her art show and says, "Hey, remember when we were going to be independent? Whatever happened to that?" So it's this kind of, over time, you know, this moving in and narrowing and kind of a return to this, you know, doll's house of the family home.
Yep. Yeah, no, I love that you brought in the sort of tiny furniture metaphor here. But yeah, no, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing, and it's not a New York narrative you see that often, because most people living in New York have already taken the leap of faith because they've come from elsewhere, and then they have to be independent. They have to, you know, duke it out to stay and live with roommates and be in uncomfortable situations, and they're far from home, and it's do or die and now or never, and they don't want to go back, so they'll do whatever they can. Whereas if you're already from here, you can kind of like fall backwards into this state of protracted adolescence. It's, you know, in certain ways that's a film about New York, but it's also a film that could be about anyone moving back in with their suburban parents. You know, I think the fact that it happens to be in New York is quite an interesting tension. And I think a tension that probably has informed Lena's life and work. But I think that it in the end has kind of a very unconventional New York message, which is like, this is a safe space or a place to be, to fall backwards, which is not how most people view the city.
Right. And certainly kind of the opposite of Ren's journey.
Absolutely. Ren will do anything she can to not go back to New Jersey.
Right. Including kind of at the final shots of turning backwards towards, you know, towards the car.
Yeah.
So we have another question in the chat that I was planning to pose to you at some point, so I'm going to bring it up now. So I'll say my version of this question, which is that since this is the Tauby Center for Jewish Studies, I do want to ask, can we think of these as Jewish movies? You know, for this series, we looked only at the filmmakers and whether or not they were Jewish American women. But I'm curious whether you perceived something Jewish about the movies themselves, and if so, what that might be. And I think Shayna is an expert on this also, so I would love to get Shayna's response, and Paloma and everyone.
Yeah, I would love to get Shayna's response, because I mean, I'm Jewish, but I'm no expert on Jewish studies. But I will say that it was funny because there was a meme going around yesterday that was like, you know, what's something that isn't Jewish but feels Jewish to you? I mean, it was done about a lot of different things. And I remember a bunch of people just said like New York, bagels.
Right.
Bagels are Jewish, but whatever. But kind of, you know, New York and everything about New York feels Jewish to me in certain ways. Like in being a New York film, it's already sort of put a flag in the sand. That being said, I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure. I mean, obviously these are Jewish filmmakers, but I think can we read Ren as Jewish? I don't know. Her family seems, it's hard to say. What do you think, Shayna?
I definitely think Ren is not supposed to be Jewish. She has a line about, you know, some nun at her Catholic.
Right. I feel like she's Catholic.
Yeah, I think but I think that's another thing. Like, I think Italian Catholic New Yorkers map onto Jewishness, right? It's like the Lenny Bruce routine about, you know, even if you're Jewish, if you live in Montana, you're Goyish. Like that's what we're seeing here. So you can be Catholic in New York and still be Jewish. And I think that's a possible reading, but I'm not sure that I see. We'll have to ask Susan Seidelman when she comes, but I think we'll have to find out if we can read Smithereens as a Jewish film. I think Tiny Furniture has more Jewishness to present to us, which might tell us something about class and Jewishness as well. But I wanted to hear if you had thoughts about the Jewishness of Tiny Furniture, and then I have some ideas.
Well, I think that the Alex Karpovsky character certainly reads to me as Jewish.
I mean, he lies in bed reading Woody Allen.
Yeah. I would say that there's a certain quality. I think there's a certain, I think it's interesting to think about Jews and class and the ways that both movies are speaking to class, for sure, because they have very different, they take place in very different worlds, class-wise,
Yeah, I think so. I'll tell you my take about the Jewishness of Tiny Furniture. I think that if we imagine this same movie but made about a man who just graduated college and has to move back in with his family, and it would feel so Jewish, right? Because the kind of self-deprecating humor, the sort of lovable patheticness, the narcissism, all of these things are Woody Allen, right? Plus the New Yorkness, the kind of obsession with sex, but it's sort of like an impotent obsession. Like all of those things read to us as Jewish when they're performed by white men New Yorkers. But when we see it in a woman, it doesn't work as quickly for us. And well, I don't know if you were at the New Yorker at the time when Lena Dunham published the Shouts and Murmurs, Dog or Jewish Boyfriend.
No, I know the editorial, but I wasn't there.
Yes, so it's a little, just for the audience, it's a little comedy piece where she makes a sort of funny quiz. Is this my dog or my Jewish boyfriend? And there are all these things about how he's so hairy and he's really cheap and he always forgets to bring his wallet. And it's like, is it a dog or a Jewish boyfriend? And there was so much uproar. The Anti-Defamation League got involved and everybody was so mad that Lena Dunham could possibly have made such anti-Semitic jokes, where she's just using this like classic self-deprecating Jewish joke work that men have been doing for decades. But when it comes from the mouth or from the pen of a woman who doesn't read as automatically Jewish to fans, viewers, I think that sort of caught people off guard. And a lot of people sort of weren't ready to forgive her because they assumed she wasn't Jewish. And that's another part of this. So it's about how gender works with Jewishness too. I think that's a big part.
The only thing that I would add to that is I think it's pretty interesting that Lena Dunham is Jewish on her mother's side. Her mother is Jewish, and Tiny Furniture has no father. In fact, the Tiny Furniture doesn't really care about a father. We don't know if there's a divorce. We don't know if she's a widow. We don't know if there was a sperm donation. It just doesn't matter.
I'll tell you something that isn't inherently Jewish, but feels Jewish to me is matrilineal stories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everything.
Can you say more about that?
Well, just that Judaism is passed through the mother, and I think that we have obsession with Jewish mothers in our culture, but Jewish people too. I mean, I'm obsessed with my mother, who's obsessed with her mother. And I think that is, the figure of the Jewish mother is obviously, tropey and exaggerated. But I think that there is a sense of stories about mothers and daughters, to me, feel like they have a lot of sort of strong, not just like Jewish roots, but just sort of a lot of themes in them that kind of overlap with a lot of Jewish thinking. Yeah, I mean, I just think, the fact that it's a story about a mother and daughter, both artists, both struggling to understand one another, feels to me like it's about things passed between mother and daughter too, which is, again, the way that, Judaism is passed down matrilineally.
Right. I think like, even though there's this assumption of some kind of wealth and success in Aura's life, or was that her name, Aura? Yes.
Yeah.
There's something really gritty still about how it's filmed and how her life as it's moving forward and her peers. where we don't necessarily envision a future of great wealth for the younger set. And I think there's something here again about gender and class and our willingness to love characters who are kind of narcissistic. We're not so willing to do it when they don't have money. But if we look at a show like Sex and the City, also New York, also Jewish in a lot of ways, there we have women.
Shouldn't Carrie Bradshaw be Jewish, but isn't? That's what I feel like.
Yeah, well, it's like she is, but she's not. She's like Elaine Bennis. I mean, it's this
Elaine, yeah.
It's this world of like wealth and beauty and fashion, and so it's sort of like, of course we're supposed to love these women, but they're also kind of narcissistic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you follow the discourse, but there are plenty of people who hate.
Oh yes. Yeah.
No, and hate Sex in the City. I personally love it, and I'm in a strong in the camp of solidly defending that show. But I think that a lot of people
I think at the
trouble
time.
What about the movies?
Yeah.
I disavow the movies. The movies don't exist to me. They're dead to me.
Canon. I think at the time the show came out, the assumption was that we love these women, we want to be these women, these are our sisters, we want relationships with girlfriends like they have. But because Ren and her girlfriends, who are not really her friends, or they don't have that same, that beauty surrounding them, we can't love them. I was thinking of the TV show Shrill with A.D. Bryant. I think it's a show. It's another sort of like young narcissistic woman who sort of uses her friends to get what she wants. And the question is whether or not we can love her if she's beautiful enough that we love her. And I think that's sort of what Lena Dunham is knowingly putting in our faces, this question of, I dare you to hate me.
Yeah. I mean, and pushes that even further in Girls, because Hannah, I think, is probably even more of a pushing on that button than Aura. But I think a lot of it is about age, though. I mean, the women in Sex and the City are 35 at the beginning of the show, 33 maybe. I think she has her 35th birthday in the second season. They're established in New York. They already all started with like quite amazing professional careers and regular sources of income. And Smithereens, Girls, and Tiny Furniture are all cultural documents about people in their early 20s, which I think it's hard to root for really young people all the time, because you see them as kind of like gregarious lambs who just want the world and feel entitled to it and believe they should have it, and sometimes are ruthless in pursuit of it, as opposed to sort of like they have bona fides and they've earned their place, and they've paid their dues and now they're here. I mean, I think that's maybe a difference too. It's just the age gaps between the two things that you mentioned. But yeah, I mean, I think it's both things, though. I think sometimes people resent the women of Sex and the City for their wealth, as opposed to like looking at something like Smithereens, or as the women of After Hours, which I mentioned earlier in this call, like say Terry Garr or young Catherine O'Hara, who have become quite lovable characters because they're supposed to be these like outsider artists with no money. I mean, I think that's kind of why there may be a difference even in the two films that we talked about in terms of like, do we identify or resent them? I mean, I think that people don't like Ren as a character sometimes because they think she's abrasive, or that like she just like wants so much and she's willing to do whatever she can to get it, and she doesn't have a lot of boundaries. But I think that's a different thing than sometimes people thinking of the character of Aura as like a pretty privileged person who kind of has like a lot of options laid out to her on a platter. And even though some of those aren't artistic right away, or the job that she wants, and she has to, be a call girl at a restaurant, it's still like you have a place to live in downtown Manhattan that isn't rat infested, that isn't where you have a mattress on the floor, that is a safe and clean space for you. And Ren doesn't have that kind of certainty or security. So I think actually I'm more liable to identify with and feel sympathetic towards Ren, even though she's not necessarily a more sympathetic character. But I think on a class level, that's where my sympathies lie.
Yeah, it would be interesting to ask Susan Seidelman if she feels that Ren has any kind of Jewishness, in her, if that was meant to be a part of the character. precisely because she seems to have, you know, a relationship to casting where she takes some of the ethnicity of the background of the actor. So I read an interview with her about Desperately Seeking Susan, in which she said, you know, look, Mark Blum is Jewish, Arquette is Jewish. This is a Jewish family. This is and this is a part of that story. And I think in that movie, they give you more opportunities to see the characters as Jewish, not just with acting, not just because of who the actors are. You know, there's a scene where they're grabbing food out of the fridge, and it's like a kind of very Jewish staging of it. But here we do have this Jewish woman at the center of this film, even if she's, you know, kind of playing Italian because of how the dynamic was set up at the time. So Paloma has a couple of questions that she put down that aren't exactly about the two movies, but I think we really want to ask you about. So this is like a good time to kind of jump in. And also if people want to have general questions for Rachel about her projects and work, please put them in the chat. Don't have to stay on to Smithereens and Tiny Furniture. Paloma.
So I wanted to ask you, because I know you write features and essays on so many different interesting topics, from like what you were mentioning, like fashion to film, television, politics, feminism. But I was just wondering, like, what your favorite thing, if you have a favorite thing to write about, is, and like what comes most naturally to you, and like, did you always see yourself doing what you're doing now?
Thanks, Paloma. You know, I am a devoted generalist, which I like to write about a bunch of different things, but I think my favorite thing to do is write profiles of people. I think that's where I just love to, I love to interview people, and I love to spend time with people and sort of find out what makes artists tick and really hear it from them. You know, when I started out, I didn't know that I was going to love interviewing as much as I do, and now it's my very favorite part of my job. So that's a big thing. But subjects I'm drawn to, I mean, I really like writing about clothes, but more of the lived experience of clothes rather than kind of like the business of fashion. I like to write about sort of costume design or various pieces and sort of do a close reading of the iconography. And I love to write about music. I like to write about television. So just culture. I mean, I'm a culture journalist. I don't really do a lot of, you know, hard news. So I think fashion is political and is, you know, can never be divorced from what's going on in the wider world. But yeah, no, I find interviewing and writing profiles to be my very favorite.
Totally. And on kind of like that vein of interviewing, and I know like you've interviewed icons from like Barbra Streisand to like Lady Gaga and like many more. So I wanted to ask, so you've spoken, you know, to these icons, singers, actors, you know, artists. So what advice do you have for like the next generation of singers, actors, artists? Yeah, I was just wondering.
I mean, everybody has different lessons to impart, but I'd say that one of the main themes that people always tell me is that they, at some point, had a choice whether or not to stick to their guns, and then they did. Like, I always feel like, you know, my friend Brian Koppelman, who writes the show Billions, has a great podcast called The Moment, and that podcast is all about interviewing sort of celebrities and artists about the moment that they knew they were going to make it, but also like a real turning point in their life. And I think that's what I'm always trying to get to when I interview people, is like that moment. Like, when did you stand up for something you believe in, or make an aesthetic choice, or walk away from something because you knew that there was something else coming that might be better? And almost every person I've interviewed has had a moment. And then I think it's all about sort of like coming up with a set of artistic values and then sticking to them. But I think it's also just like, you know, it's hard. It's a hard time. Everything is changing. I mean, what it takes to be an artist now is not the same thing as it took Barbra Streisand. I mean, she had a voice of honeyed gold at 18 and just got really lucky. I think that's a different, you know, that still happens to people. You could sing on TikTok and be the next Adele, and it does happen for some people. But I think there's a lot of luck involved in fame, and a lot of persistence as well. I think it's, I mean, the people that I have interviewed that are hyper successful, like say Lady Gaga, is a person who was preternaturally talented, but then worked really hard. I mean, she plays the piano still every day. Like, she works so hard. And, you know, I interviewed Alanis Morissette, and we talk a lot about Jagged Little Pill, and she just worked really hard on that record. I mean, every day she would come into the studio and have, you know, a new journal full of lyrics. I mean, these are people that really wanted it. Like, you know, the idea of like easy fame is, I think, quite a myth that needs to be dispelled. Like, most of the people that are at that level just really wanted it at some point, really, really wanted it. Like, which is why I like Ren, because you can see she just really wants it. And that's why I kind of believe she's going to make it, even with this sort of sad, depressing ending. I'm like, well, she certainly wants it bad enough, which is half the battle.
So maybe we'll come back to the movies for a second, because one of the things that's striking about Tiny Furniture is that we never really see Aura try to create something new. Over the course of it, she made movies in college. She, you know, has, and now they're being shown, you know, in this in a gallery context where they're being put onto a small CRT TV for people to watch it, you know, not as much as like a movie, and for the enjoyment in the experience of a theater, or in the experience of, you know, Talby Center sponsored stream from a platform. But, you know, that it's disconnected from the act of filmmaking, and we don't see her try and kind of make anything new as it goes on. And there's that obvious kind of contradiction with Lena Dunham as someone who works really hard.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I think Lena has such an interesting career because her thing is being kind of the poet laureate of laziness, and yet she herself is like the hardest working, for a long time was one of the hardest work. I mean, I don't know what she's up to at this moment. I think she's a producer now, but I think when she was writing Girls and you know, coming off of Tiny Furniture, she had like 1,000 projects. And she had, like you said, she had pieces in the New Yorker, she had a television show, she was working on a movie, like, you know, she never slowed down. And yet at the same time, all of her characters that she played, particularly, I think if you look ahead to Girls with Hannah, but like Aura as well, like didn't really make anything, or actually like were afraid of it or actively resisted it at certain points. And then, you know, Girls ends with this strange sort of bizarre message, which is like the most significant thing Hannah makes as a baby, which I think is a really strange way to end the series, but also kind of a poignant one. That being said, I think, you know, with Aura, yeah, that's what's interesting about it, is that she so desperately wants, and you see her mother making things. That's the other thing. Like, you see Laurie constantly making tiny furniture and photographing it, and is clearly a very devoted artist, to the point where she's kind of disassociative from her family because she's down in her studio constantly creating. And you see, I think that can also be hard. I mean, you know, not for nothing, if you have artistic parents, I imagine that it is difficult to think that you could measure up to what they have created or their kind of work ethic. And you might want to do it yourself, but you also probably have a lot of baggage that you're carrying around about not only just nepotism, but then also like, do I have anything to say outside the context of my parents, who suck up a lot of the oxygen artistically in this household? So I think that might be an interesting sort of dynamic that she's exploring, where Ren, in order to be an artist or whatever she thinks she is, a punk robot, whatever she wants to be, you know, has had to separate from her family completely, sort of reinvent herself, become a new person outside of the context of her former life. Whereas, like, you know, Aura is trying to figure out how to become a new person within the context of a very almost suffocating artistic milieu. And I think that's a very different challenge. So I think sometimes it's not so much that she doesn't create, it's that she can't. It's that she's sort of stifled by where she is. Like, I think it probably would have been better had she not returned home. But that wasn't really an option, you know, financially.
This relates, this idea of the successful artists that you've interviewed who have had a moment to stick to their guns, and the story of Aura, who is not able, for whatever reason, to continue the creative process, or maybe who didn't make the choice to continue creating. This relates to a question that I think we can all sort of think about, that somebody asked, which is, what is your advice to young people living in New York on how to deal with burnout?
Oh my God, I saw that in the chat and I was like, I don't know. I mean, I actually am in the middle of reading Anne Helen Peterson's book on burnout right now, called Can't Even. And it is so fascinating, just how many people of my generation feel absolutely burnt out, no matter if they lived in New York or not. I think my main sort of burnout solution has always been to try to cultivate something that's just for myself outside of my work. And it can be so difficult in New York because your work is so all encompassing, because most people have to work so hard just to afford to live here. And so your work becomes part of your identity because it has to, because you're doing it 60 hours a week and that's all anyone ever wants to talk about. I'm kind of hoping that the pandemic reorients people, starts talking about all the things that they do when they're not working, especially because now we're in people's houses and you see on Zoom your coworkers having lives that are extracurricular and totally different from how you saw them in the office, and people start to become fully fleshed out real people to each other. And I think that might make people feel like they have an identity outside of their work. But I think for me, it's always been like having, did I freeze?
No, you're good.
Intermittently.
Okay. Sorry. I think for me, it's always been like having hobbies. I know that sounds crazy, but it's really like you have to actively pursue that in New York, like to have something. I'm taking chess lessons right now on Zoom after watching The Queen's Gambit. I often, I mean, I read a lot of books just for pleasure. I have a typewriter that I love to use. I mean, there's various things that you can do. I think burnout is very, very real though. I think it's like get a good therapist and get enough sleep and drink enough water and make sure you have a good support system. I also think it's good to have friends that don't do the same thing that you do, if you can. I think that, you know, when you're young in New York, you tend to fall into scenes and crowds, and I think it's great to have a bunch of friends that are in your same industry, just so that you can all sort of back channel and talk to each other about work and how it's going, and make sure everyone's getting paid equally and fairly and not working with a creep and all these things that Whisper Networks can help you with. But I also think it's really great to have friends in New York City that are not involved in your industry, because this is a really diverse place, and a place that's full of so many different pathways to the city. And if you're just intermingling with one group of people, not only can you get burnt out, but you can get kind of discouraged, I find. And I find that everybody has a different, like, you know, one of my best friends is a midwife, and her experience of New York is like a totally different experience than a writer. I mean, pre-pandemic, she was just in a bunch of people's apartments, home birthing babies. And that's a very different interaction with the city than a journalist. And I love talking to her about that and what she learns about New Yorkers that way. So I think it's about, finding various communities and having hobbies.
So since you bring up hobbies, first, I want to encourage anyone who has a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand so we can get it before we end our session in about 10 minutes. But you have a very big hobby right now of organizing pen pal groups.
Oh my God, Penpalooza, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm wondering maybe if you could talk about, I'm in the business of like buying collections of letters or trying to get people to give me collections of letters. So I'm wondering.
Oh, really? What's the most recent acquisition for you?
Of actual letters?
Yeah.
I'd have to check, but I will happily send you that information when we finish. But this is the thing that it's something that we try to get a lot of, and I'm kind of curious what attracted you to starting this pen pal club and how it's going, and what you're getting out of it.
Yeah, well, it's if anybody wants to join, you can go to my Twitter, and I have information there about how to do it. But basically, at the beginning of the pandemic, I bought my typewriter, which I had mentioned, and I was writing a bunch on it, and I realized that I wanted to start writing letters to people, because I was sort of as holed up. Like I said, I was in New York the entire lockdown during the bad part where we couldn't leave our apartment. So I was like, oh, this feels like a time for me to sit in my office and just write letters to people. And it became so addictive for me that I think I went on Instagram first and asked who wanted to be my pen pal. And I got a huge response. So then I was like, oh, I can't keep up with all these people. Maybe everybody wants to be pen pals with each other. So I went to Twitter and then briefly sort of mentioned there, does anybody have an interest in a pen pal exchange? And I got a lot of people saying yes. So I actually set it up with Secret Santa software, because there's no actual pen pal software available online. I'm sorry to not be Jewish. It's unfortunately highly secular.
I ran a honey cake exchange, and I also use Secret Santa software.
I mean, Elfster is, I think, for everyone. I think yes, it has the Santa vibe, but so we set it up there, and I got 1,000 signups in the first week, and now we have over 7,000 people, which is crazy. In a great way. And it's called Penpalooza. People are constantly sending letters back and forth to each other. You get a match when you sign up on the site. I actually can I'll drop the sign up link in the chat just in case anybody's interested in joining. yeah, and people are really into it. Like, people, there's a hashtag on Twitter, hashtag #PenPalooza, and you can see all the letters people send back and forth to each other. Some are quite ornate. Some people, I mean, a woman who raises chickens in Oregon sent farm fresh eggs through the USPS, and they made their way across the country in one piece to her pen pal. People are sending, books and tea and stickers and perfumes and all these things over in the mail. And then on top of that, people ask me all the time for extra pen pals. So some people have 5 people going now, and their mail is just constantly coming in. And it's this thing that I didn't realize would be a whole thing, but we have been in lockdown forever. And I thought we would be, people were talking about lockdown being over by the end of the summer. And now it looks like it's going to be years. And I think the mail has become this unexpected source of intimacy and connection for people while they are isolated alone. So I'm really glad that it has worked out that way.
Cool. So
I love reading archival letters. You can see it here. I have this book. I have the book, The Archive of Letters of Note, and I'm currently reading this very wonky book about the history of the post office, and it's quite good. And I've become quite interested in just correspondence history in general.
Yeah, well, we
buy grab really quick for y'all.
Stanford libraries. We buy lots of letters. We take donations of lots of letters. We invite people to come work for it. I mean, one of it's usually one-sided. We usually don't have both sides of the correspondence, simply because there was one person who kept it, and then we have it there. I think actually that's the most recent acquisition I got, is something like 12,000 letters from a professor in Concordia University in Canada, who is connecting with all sorts of people about World War II history, and in touch with far-right groups in the US and elsewhere, and Holocaust deniers, and just I'm excited for people to come and unpack this.
Totally. I mean, letters are my favorite manuscripts, art division places to be. I love looking at people's collected letters in archives. I think it's so fun. I mean, I remember one of the last great days I had before lockdown. Also, by the way, I put the link in the chat for anybody who wants to join Penpalooza. Was that I went to the New York Public Library's manuscripts division, and I looked at Deanna Vreeland's, the notorious former Harper's Bazaar and Vogue editor-in-chief's postcard collection. I was thinking about doing a piece on it, and she would do these postcards from Europe when she was on her trips that would be like 1 line long, which she would send back to other editors at Vogue. That would just be inspiration she had and just dashed off. So she'd be in Pamplona and she'd see the running of the bulls, and she'd just send to like another editor, just the color of fall is bullfighter red, and just send this postcard off. Just so much vibrancy that she just had to tell someone right then, and sent it in all these postcards, and those are great. So yeah, I love archival letters, and everyone should take advantage of them, when they can again, for sure.
Great. So we have a kind of a cryptic question in the Q&A that I want to bring up, because I think it might be a good last question. Anonymous attendee writes, are both characters in the wrong place, or are they actually in the right place?
That's a really interesting question, because I can't tell whether or not the ultimate message of both movies is that New York is ever the right place, or that it always is kind of an uncomfortable fit that you're grappling with. I mean, I know there's a bit of a turning away from New York for LA vibe going on as well. I mean, I think that is very cryptic. I want to hear what you all think, but I think my sense would be that they're in the right place to figure out that they might be in the wrong place. Is that anything? I feel like, sometimes New York can be revelatory, even if it's the wrong place. I think, there's been a lot of quotes to this level. I mean, almost every artist has one, but I think there's one where Amy Poehler was once doing an interview, and she said, I think everyone should be young and broke in New York at least once, even though it's absolutely terrible. And I think that's kind of what the point is. It's like there is some kind of crucible in which people feel they are formed in New York City as young and angsty and broke, and sometimes that the lesson they learn is they can't be there anymore. And I have a lot of friends who have had that revelation, and they're so much happier elsewhere. A lot of them have moved to California, and they have sunshine all the time, and they have serotonin and vitamin D. and they feel better and they're happier and more productive and, you know, whatever. But I think those of us that have stuck it out in New York constantly every single year, especially around this time when it starts to get dark at 3:45 in the afternoon and wintry, think, am I in the wrong place? But I think that it's kind of one of these cities that continually reassures you you're in the right place in the smallest of ways. I find that it is one of these places where I could be so despondent about New York and so over it. And, you know, back in the pre-pandemic days, I would have been maybe like, you know, sloshed on the subway by someone else's coffee. And I would have had you know, I forgot my umbrella and you come out of the subway and it's raining and the place you wanted to go is closed that day for no reason. And you're just like, oh, New York is just rejecting me. It's not agreeing with me. And then you can turn a corner and walk down a street that you remember from 7 years ago. And it's quiet and there's twinkle lights and you hear music from some distant window and you just think like, this is the city for me. And it's such a small, quiet, personal moment. And I think that like New York for a lot of people is like 99% the wrong place, 1% the right place. And in that 1% makes lifelong New Yorkers.
That was really beautiful.
Yeah, we had 2 minutes, but I don't feel like we can actually ask another question given that note that you just closed on.
And living, I live in San Francisco, where it's also a kind of local sport to talk about when you're going to move. And there are many similarities, and I think we'll talk later in the semester later in the academic year with Rewind about LA and the scene there and this kind of these bi-coastal fantasies of California and New York, which we saw.
Absolutely, and I'm so interested to hear what Susan thinks about that.
Yeah, well, we hope you'll come.
I will.
This was really wonderful, and we thank you so much, Rachel Syme, for all of your really interesting and compelling and personal insights into these films and into New York and into our current moment and into the pursuit of art. It was really valuable, and thank you so much. Thank you to Paloma, our undergraduate.
Thank you all for having me. Yeah, and thank you, Aitan and Paloma and Shana, and I really enjoyed coming back to Stanford briefly. I'm sad I couldn't do it in person, but
one day.
Yes, one day we will bring you in person.
Background.
Yes, I get a little bit of the farm.
And thank you to all of our attendees. Everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and stay resilient. Thank you so much.
Wear your mask.
Thank you.